Zul'Farrak, the sand troll temple city in the endless deserts of Tanaris.
A place at the end of the very world, and far, far from home. I'm Shuppzy, and in this episode of Warcraft Space and Story, we're going to see how lore and game design justify and build off each other to create a more memorable and overall stronger experience. The first time you'd have gone to Zul'Farrak would have been somewhere in the mid-level 40s. Level 60 and the endgame was starting to be a real goal, rather than some abstract aim, so the game had to start preparing you for that and giving you a taste of what you'd experience when you hit that big number. Really, I'm tempted to call Zul'Farrak a tutorial of sorts. The last tutorial, maybe even, and I'll try and explain that stance as we go through. This little portal room here before the dungeon proper has some quite cool things that I think really give a sense of the dungeon to come. The architecture and tiki masks are in the jungle troll style, which would be super familiar to anyone that came here after leveling in Stranglethorn Vale, or was a troll. But the piles of skulls and dilapidated look of everything says that this place isn't exactly in its prime, and the lore supports this. So unlike the Drakari in Northrend, the Sand Trolls never really formed an empire on their own and were instead a part of the Gurubashi Empire. And at a guess, were reliant on them for resources and culture up until the Sundering, which makes sense, living in a desert and all. Once we actually enter the dungeon, this feeling gets reinforced even more. What's ancient is huge, impressive and permanent, even with ruined parts, while what's new are effectively shanties, attempting to make some use of the geography of the place in order to survive. One thing I find really cool about this dungeon is how little anyone seems to care about you. I had trouble finding any mobs in here who looked like they were on guard or ready to repel invaders. Instead, most seem caught up in their conversations or other daily activities. It really sells the fact that this is a city you and your party are invading. However, quite cleverly in terms of this being a dungeon thing, these little social circles lend themselves really well to an enemy pack density you don't normally get. And it's worth remembering, the mobs here have fear spells. Now these archways are probably one of the more obvious section markers we've talked about thus far in this series, but it's still worth bringing up what they do. Zul'Farrak tends to swap between two major themes: the residential areas with the little mountain huts we were talking about earlier and tents, and the more grand spiritually or culturally focused sections, hence me calling it a temple city. And it's these archways that let us know when we're moving from one theme to the other. Once we do pass through that archway, we're greeted to the sight of this really imposing monument on the hill, watching over the whole area. It's a cool visual moment and almost gives the sense that the city itself is challenging you, looking down and judging you. That's why I wish it was given just a bit more importance, either slightly larger or lit more dramatically like in the loading screen, because I'll admit I never really acknowledged it until I came in here for this video. Directly under the gaze of our friend on the hill, we find this little fountain thing, which looks a lot like a crossroads marker, so fits perfectly because this is where we hit a crossroads in the dungeon. What's really interesting about Zul'Farrak is that it essentially makes a circuit. You can do all the bosses bar one in whatever order you like, and following either path all the way through leads you back here. So again, we see a spatial design decision that builds off the lore that this is a city, and people, well, they need to get around. Which I think is also the reason you get to mount in here. For the sake of this video though, we're going to go to the right first because for some reason that's the way all the groups I've ever done this with went. So after a small residential area, you find yourself in this room, absolutely teeming with scarabs. And while we've seen the odd one here and there thus far in the dungeon, the sheer number of them in this room says to the player that it is, for whatever reason, important. And the reason it's important is this guy, Theka the Martyr, who although he doesn't look it, is undead. So Theka's story is that he effectively saved Zul'Farrak from a Karaji attack that made it deep into the city. Although he was eventually brought down, as he died he cursed his attackers and transformed them into the scarabs we see in this room. There's a few other things of note here too. Around the walls we have these mummified bodies who are sat up in sand urns and seem to watch over Theka's little shrine. So why they're interesting is because the Sandfury tribe practice necromancy fairly extensively, and as we'll see later, usually bury their dead in shallow dirt graves because they're more than likely going to just be raised up again as zombies fairly soon, so why go to the effort? These urns in comparison seem much more ceremonial, and are likely the honoured dead or bodies from a time before the Faraki adopted necromancy to help stem their ever-dwindling numbers. The other major thing is this, the ancient tablet, which when interacted with tells you about something called the Mallet of Zul'Farrak. and says you have to go to the forest troll city of Chinta Alor in the hinterlands to go create it. Now, just as a reminder, the hinterlands are on the opposite side of the world on a different continent. But with the way raid attunements used to work in WoW, especially vanilla, this was on the light side of globetrotting adventures. And it's an example of what I mean of this being a sort of first taste of endgame. Lore-wise, I'm not really sure why the creation of the Mallet of Zul'Farrak is tied to the hinterlands. My best guess is that it was some kind of show of respect between the Gurubashi and Amani empires after the war against the Akir. From a broken corner of the wall, we seem to leave the boundaries of the city, and as we wind round this small hill, a cave appears in front of us, so the natural inclination is to go explore it. Once you get too close, however, this happens, where effectively the boss pulls you, a trick Blizzard would later use again in the original version of Naxxramas with patchwork. So this is Antu Sul, who the lore tells us is a bit of a loner and prefers basilisks to his fellow Faraki trolls. Of more interest to those who originally went through this place though, he has the weapon Sang Thraze, which when combined with another weapon, Jang Thraze, creates the sword Sul Thraze the Lasher. And so what, you say? Well, it was an epic item, in a time where even at max level, having epics was something to talk about. And these are the shallow graves I mentioned earlier, which serves to give Zul'Farrak a self-regenerating population, and in times of absolute desperation, a food source, given that trolls are no strangers to cannibalism. So there's a real contrast here, coming either from or to, depending on the path you took at that fork in the road, Thekka's room, which seems all about honouring the dead and preserving history, and here, where both are being twisted for the sake of survival. So it's clear that this is Blizzard's take on the whole voodoo zombie thing, and also works to give some undead enemies for variety, and lets players use some of their lesser used spells which only affect the undead. Overseeing this operation is Witch Doctor Zumra, who for reasons I never really worked out is tagged as friendly until you move close to him. Maybe working with the living dead all day made him a bit jaded to people's comings and goings. Either way, it's yet another hint to how barely Zul'Farrak is being held together by the time we get here, where a spiritual and communal leader in a troll witch doctor is forced to be equal parts undertaker and recruitment officer. Passing once again under an arch, we enter the largest open space of the dungeon so far, with a huge Aztec-like pyramid in our view, with what's at the top hidden very carefully. And it all just begs to be explored. So we ascend the steps, and at the top we find an executioner and 5 prisoners on some kind of altar stone. So despite all the desperation and problems plaguing Zul'Farrak, this tells us that instead of seeking help from the larger world, they've become more isolationist and more xenophobic. So it kind of helps to relieve the feeling that we're basically delivering the coup de grace to the dying husk of a nation. Which is absolutely what we're doing. The 5 cages are very significant too, containing prisoners of a number of races and factions that just so happen to contain the same number of adventurers as there are in the player's party. So it really works to make the players feel good about how awesome they are. Freeing Sergeant Bly and his party is a great feel-good moment, as the NPCs cheer for you and you're promised rewards for your heroism. However, as you turn to descend the stairs and move on to the next boss, you see this. So remember when I said earlier, it's like no one in this city cares about you? Well, now they care. And it works to create what I still think is one of the coolest dungeon encounters Blizzard's ever put together. In terms of space, it's really clever, because height usually conveys power, but in this case, it's more like you've been penned in with these guys you literally met a minute ago and have to fight to survive against the wrath of an entire city. Finally, you fight your way through the slaves and soldiers, priests and peasants, and descend once again where you take the fight to Necrum Gutchua and Shadow Priest Seziz. There's not much to say about these guys, but it is interesting that, like Thekka, Necrum is undead, so we can see there's not even really a stigma attached to being a zombie in Sand Fury society. So after the pyramid event, we get the chance to finally open the huge gate in this area that had been taunting us, especially considering how open everything else about the dungeon is. From there, there's this weird little episode which changes hugely based on whether or not you had quests for this place. If so, you confront Sergeant Bly for being a thief, and he attacks you. If not, you kill him for not paying you, which is very mercenary. Either way, it's most likely you end up with the chance to pass through these gates and see what it was that had been locked away from you. What you find is this heavily snake-themed shrine, interestingly on the same hill as the monument from the start of the dungeon, which is some really nice bookending. The bosses you find here are Chief Ukor Sandscalp, who is continuing his people's proud tradition of ignoring you, and Ruzlu, which brings me to something kinda odd about troll dungeon bosses, especially in vanilla. In a fair few cases there's the boss you expect to be there, in this case the Chief of the Sand Fury, or something like the Prophet Jamalan in the Sunken Temple. And then there's just this other guy with them, named and everything. Take from that what you will, it's just something I found kinda interesting. With Sandscalp dead, in a lot of ways the dungeon's ended. The Faraki have been near annihilated, and the goblins of Tanaris are now safe. However, if you were to leave now, there would still, depending on the path you took first, be some hope for a revival and a continuation of their evil ways. If you'd come from the left, you'd be leaving the undead forces of the Sand Trolls, and even potentially providing them more troops. But if you'd come the way we did, you have something else, something very different to deal with. So let's say our hypothetical player decided to finish this thing off properly. What they'd find in this space is the Shrine of Gazrilla, which is one of the most built up and well maintained in the entire dungeon, with a lot of serpent and head based motifs, which is a cute way of hinting at its purpose. Of particular note is that gong, but before dealing with that, a patrolling boss demands our attention. This is Hydromancer Velratha, and from the name, the bright blue hair and clothing tips you off to a theme you probably wouldn't expect in a desert dungeon: water. She patrols around the pool, stopping to pray at it every so often, and her story is that she's one of the few Sand Fury trolls to have left Zul'Farrak and Tanaris in general, and in her travels she's become powerful and acquired artifacts to help her in protecting this sacred pool. With Velratha dealt with, we get to turn our attention back to this mysterious gong. If no one in your party has made the trek to the hinterlands and actually acquired the Mallet of Zul'Farrak, then here is where your journey ends. With the mallet, however, it becomes the means by which you summon the Hydra, Gazrilla. So Gazrilla is obviously a huge Hydra. It's referred to a number of times as a demigod, so it may very well be the Hydra wild god or ancient. In a lot of ways, Gazrilla is similar to Akumai in Black Fathom Deeps, both being said to be powerful pets of the old gods. However, we've seen a few old gods thus far, and not many Hydras, so I think if that claim is true, then they are specifically favoured by N'Zoth, who seems to have a lot of underwater and deep sea themes. The death of Gazrilla closes the story of Zul'Farrak, a space that gave us more freedom than other dungeons, with mounting and non-linearity, but also a place that asked more from us. Our paths had to be chosen carefully, and we had to go out into the world to experience it fully. Its story too reflected this level of deeper complexity. It's easy to be heroes taking on the powerful, evil empire, but a bit less so to be stomping the still evil empire as it lay bleeding in the gutter. I've been Shuppzy, and that was the story of the space and how the space has told a story. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please like it, subscribe, share it, all that awesome stuff. And I really love hearing from you guys, whether it's suggestions of where to go next or some constructive criticism. So thank you for your time.